Welcome back once again to the Imaginary Gallery. It's TJ, your host, and tonight's discussion is reactive versus predatory aggression. And some of it's taken from this particular book I've mentioned before, In Sheep's Clothing, Understanding and Dealing with Manipulative People by George Simon Jr., Ph.D. All these authors are Ph.D.s. But Dr. Simon starts off by saying that some of us say it's a dog-eat-dog world, in the business world or elsewhere, and one has to claw their way to the top. But he's telling us there's a difference between the fair competition that breeds excellence and the crafty, underhanded, or covert maneuvering that sometimes wreaks havoc in the workplace or in the personal place. And he's telling us that having to work with a covertly aggressive coworker can be a significant source of occupational stress. And then he's going to tell you a story about a lady who never fights openly or fairly for what she wants. Neither her drive, ambition, nor desire for power and position are problems in themselves. Properly managed, these are desirable traits in anyone trying to get ahead in their company and to help their coworkers achieve excellence. The really disturbing thing about her, though, is the devious way she goes about getting what she wants. So the story begins. For a lady without prior training or experience in an executive position, everybody agreed that Betty was one of the key people in the firm. Whenever the boss needed something special accomplished, he could count on Betty's willingness to work hard and get it done. She was familiar with most operations within the organization, having survived several changes in administration. She was indispensable. Despite her value to most every department, not everyone felt comfortable around Betty. There was an uneasy feeling that one could experience whenever disagreeing with her. One of the coworkers once remarked that one time he challenged Betty, he got a feeling in his gut like the time he came close to his neighbor's fence and the Doberman pinscher on the other side was growling and baring its teeth. Nobody could really point to anything specific that Betty had done overtly cruel to anyone. But almost intuitively, everyone knew it would be unwise to make an enemy of her. Now, when Jack came on board as the new executive assistant, many in the organization had high hopes for some positive changes. Betty let the boss know that despite the fact that several others have failed in this role, she would do her best to help Jack learn the ropes. The boss expressed his usual gratitude for her willingness to be of service. He introduced the two of them, letting him know that she'd be his greatest resource, and advised him to treat her well. Betty seemed very helpful to Jack. She was frequently complimentary of him, too, even though she knew many of the changes he wanted to make just would not work. She always made it a point to tell the boss she believed that Jack had the best of intentions, even if his ideas were underdeveloped. She even made it a point to tell her coworkers to just give Jack a little time and to learn to mellow, and then they wouldn't have to worry about some of the things he was trying to accomplish. In the meantime, she assured everyone she'd keep her usual watchful eye on things and be sure to keep the boss informed in her visits with him. It was a bit of a surprise to Betty that some of the coworkers actually started to like Jack and the changes he was making. And when she went to the boss, he stopped saying things such as, "I'm glad to hear you're keeping an eye on things," and instead started saying things like, "I wasn't sure about Jack's idea at first, but now it's beginning to make sense. And it seems like all the workers are behind this new program. Maybe we found the right person." Well, Betty's biggest surprise was learning and discovering she had less and less to do. People were growing increasingly fond of Jack, and Betty knew it. One day, while having lunch with the boss's wife, She was surprised to learn just how personally attached to Jack her employer was becoming. She also learned some things about her boss she didn't know before. She found out how quirky and close-minded he could be, like the time he had fired a chauffeur after learning he was gay. Betty would later tell a friend how much it pained her to approach her boss when she did. After all, she said, she didn't really want to hurt Jack. She just thought her boss would be better informed and the company better served if the whole truth about Jack were known. And then she said, quote, "I just want you to know that it's the short-sighted plans he's making I disagree with, sir. You know, I personally like Jack," she insisted. "I know some of the others talk about it, but whatever his sexual orientation, it doesn't bother me at all." Well, Jack was becoming increasingly distressed about the growing distance between himself and the boss. He couldn't imagine why the rapport they'd established had so rapidly deteriorated. Due to decreased access to his supervisor, he became more reliant upon Betty to provide him with the information as well as advocate his plan. She helped him see that the boss was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with some of his work, but didn't want to undergo the emotional ordeal it would be to fire him. He was even somewhat comforted by the fact Betty went to the trouble of giving him some leads about other openings at other companies. Everyone was surprised the day Jack left. Everyone, that is, except Betty. She told herself several times and tried to tell the others that he just wasn't the right person for the job. After all, she'd been there long enough to know what's best for the company. She couldn't spend time worrying about Jack or anyone else who might be tempted to take his place. She had lots of work to do. Well, this story is basically telling that Betty was covertly forcing Jack out. She didn't tell him, "You better leave." She didn't overtly scream at him and threaten him. No, she went sneakily behind his back to the boss, told a fake story to get the boss to turn against him, and guess what? It worked. But the author says that he knows that examining Betty's aggressive character is fraught with potentially politically incorrect danger, but he doesn't think that the uncomfortable feeling that you had when hearing the story was because she was a woman who was being aggressive. It's the way she did it that gets to you. It's her dirty, filthy, underhanded way of fighting. The author says, what you don't know can hurt you. And he says Jack got manipulated out of a job largely because he was naive about the territoriality in the competitive workplace and how aggressive personalities can stake out their turf. Although he'd been hired to fill the position of executive assistant, which had never been formalized and never successfully filled despite several prior attempts, someone was already functioning in that role. From the first minute he attempted to do what he was hired to do, he was encroaching on Betty's territory that she thought was hers. So right from the beginning, she was scoping him out for vulnerabilities and looking for the most effective place to strike. Now, because Jack didn't recognize Betty's personality type, he didn't anticipate the moves she was likely to make to maintain power. He assumed that all of her efforts were to help and support him, and they were sincere. Like many, he didn't really understand that there are characters very different from his own. Not knowing how to recognize a wolf or a wolf in sheep's clothing was his biggest vulnerability. Now, Jack has since learned to recognize such types. Unfortunately, he had to learn the hard way. Well, next, the author talks about reactive versus predatory aggression. And I'm going to take this on my own because he doesn't really continue the thought. But Betty's distinctive style, he says, of getting her way and hanging on to power illustrates a point about aggressive behavior that's all too often ignored by professionals. Aggression can be of two very different types, reactive and predatory. And he says that some researchers refer to predatory as instrumental. Reactive aggression is an emotional response to a threatening situation. It's not something we plan. It's something we spontaneously do when we are frightened to death and there's nowhere to run. the whole character of reactive aggression is different from predatory aggression. A presenter at a workshop he once attended used an analogy he's found very useful. He stated that when a cat is faced with a threatening situation, such as a bulldog approaching, the cat exhibits certain stereotypic behaviors. First, it arches its back. It may show its claws. It may hiss. Its hair stands on end. Its emotions are right on the surface. Despite its fear, it focuses its eyes on the potential attacker and does everything possible to openly and obviously signal its preparedness to aggress, in the hope the attacker will retreat and it won't have to fight. The enemy knows what might happen and gets the chance to run. Well, predatory or instrumental aggression is very different. It's not an instantaneous reaction at all. It's a planned and deliberate initiative. It's also not primarily prompted by fear, but rather fueled by desire. The mode of behavior is different too. When a cat's on the prowl, it spots a mouse, it keeps low to the ground. Its hair is undisturbed. It's quiet and careful. It remains calm and collected as possible and prepares to pounce on its prey. The intended victim never sees what's coming, just like Jack. And it's usually, when it does find out, it's too late. When a cat's stalking a mouse for lunch, it would be ridiculous to assume that the cat's doing it out of fear of the mouse, is angry with the mouse, or has unresolved anger issues in general, or is acting out past trauma of victimization by a mouse, etc. Yet, Dr. Simon says these are precisely the kinds of assumptions many mental health professionals and laypersons alike make when they march predatory aggressors into anger management classes or fear of intimacy groups. And he says it's hard for people to understand the simple underpinnings of predatory aggression, and equally hard for them to accept that all creatures are capable of this type of aggressive conduct. Popular wisdom would have it that Betty feared the loss of her job and reacted to the threat by getting rid of the enemy. But her behavior in the preceding story less resembles the startled cat and more resembles the cat on the prowl. As in all predatory aggression, Betty was not motivated by fear or any emotion other than desire. Just as the cat that simply wanted lunch, Betty's behavior reflected her appetite for power and status. Betty's crafty, clever, and cunning when it comes to getting it and keeping it. When she went after Jack, she was low to the ground, calm, collected, quiet, and never perceived as threatening before she struck, and Jack never saw it coming. Well, the part that he kind of trails off on is back to the reactive aggression, which ties into your dealings with your cluster B monster if you eventually realize you are being covertly aggressed upon. It's a natural defense in the name of self-respect to do something back. And a lot of people think, well, if I do something back, then I'm just as bad as he or she is. But no, we have to point out, it's again, you are being threatened. And it's not a threat like the bulldog running up to the cat to get it. It's more like the cat sneaking to get the mouse. Well, you're the mouse, and this person's been slowly sneaking and letting out ways here and there to indicate they're trying to get you. So if you react aggressively, you are defending yourself, just like that cat whose hair stands on end, like this, and it hisses and... Well, that is what we bring up when talking about counter-manipulation. And counter-manipulation is not something that's normally advised, but if you're in the face of a direct threat, sometimes it can at least get you out of there, or at least send the head of the monster spinning while you find a way to escape. Okay, this part of the video will be naughty, but it's a tip for any of you out there who may find yourself dealing with someone who is being covertly aggressive. Like the story we just told, if you can see that something's going on. In fact, this particular exercise is a counter-manipulation tactic that I would urge you to try. And I say that carefully because counter-manipulation can result in horror for the person conducting it. However, the particular case I'm suggesting this on would be if you are involved with someone romantically, and according to the partner, it's just the two of you, but you have plenty of reason to think that something fishy is going on behind your back with somebody else. I've done a little of this, but not all the way through, so that's why I'm sharing it here, so maybe someone else can take it further and resolve the issue. But what will oftentimes happen is you start recognizing the partner is not as around as he or she used to be, is distant, is not acting the same as usual. But when you ask, is something going on, you're told, no, you're crazy, no, you're imagining it, I'm just tired, or whatever excuse. Well, if you notice a dramatic change in this person, I mean like a noticeable change that indicates something is up, if you're trapped for some reason like a rent or mortgage or some obligation, that's the only time when I'd recommend the counter-manipulation. When you're trapped there, at least temporarily, make the most of it and defend your self-respect. Well, the suggestion would be, if you are such a person and you've noticed dramatic differences in your partner, well, what you can do is, and this is tailor-made to you, so if, for example, you're a very talkative person and you talk about anything and everything, you talk it up and down, backward, forward, well, when around your partner, it's time to switch and be the opposite. And just like if, on the other hand, if you're a very quiet person usually, well, become a really talkative person. Say anything and everything about anything you can when you're around this partner. And the idea is to behave differently. And especially this is effective if you have stated to your partner, like, hey, you're acting different than you used to. I know something's up, what's going on? And you're met with, oh no, you're crazy, oh, you're imagining. It's perfect for those scenarios, because what you're doing now is you are reversing your own behaviors. Because up to this point, you're probably being manipulated and don't know it yet, and the person's laughing to itself, thinking, this person's falling for it. And so if you switch, become the opposite of how you usually are, it probably won't be very long before the partner says something to you. Like, let's just pick the first example. You're usually talkative about anything and everything, and instead you're real quiet, and you don't really say anything. Well, when the partner catches on, you better believe you're going to hear about it. You'll be told, what's wrong with you? And you're to say, what do you mean? Nothing. What's wrong with you? You're acting strange. And that's when the tables have turned, because remember, you were first telling the monster he or she is acting strange. Well, now you're being told that. Well, now's your time to gaslight and say, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, normally you always say something about A, B, and C. Well, your response would be, well, I couldn't think of anything to say this time. You have to learn to keep the straight face like they do, like nothing's wrong. And that is your way of counter-manipulating, by behaving in the opposite way as usual, so much that they actually say something to you, and then you behave in the same manner he or she did to you, like, I don't know what you're talking about. You're imagining things. I'm no different than I ever was. Try it, see what happens, and of course get out shortly after. But that's just a tip and a suggestion, and be careful.
I am the narcopath, and I am being held here against my will. And to get out, I've been told I've got to give you another confession. I don't like doing it, but if it means my freedom so I can get another target, I'm all for it. So, stick with me.
So the word on the street is that you've been telling people that I used you. And you want me, I suppose, now to tell you how exactly I used you? How did I use thee? Let me count the ways.
Well, way number one I used you was, remember the first night you took me out and you said you had to stop by your place and apologize like it would be some kind of inconvenience? I was counting on it and hoping on it because that allowed me to start my assessment right off the bat. Well, number one was real estate. Empty real estate aside from you. You see, I'd been living with my whore roommate who had crackheads spending the night on our porch every night, and I couldn't get a beauty night's sleep. So when I saw that you had your own place and it was big enough for me and my things, that scored you points number one. A lot of points.
Way number two was transportation. Notice how I casually asked you, "Oh, do you rent this car? Or is this your roommate's car?" Before I knew you didn't have a roommate, that was kind of a trick to try to get you to tell me you didn't have a roommate. But when you told me that you owned it, point number two, I knew that there was hope for you as my next love interest.
I am the narcopath, and I wear a mask.